Hello, and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 575, The Kings of the Ring, Part 2. How do you measure a career in Grand Sumo? What are the metrics, the standards you look at when you say that someone was one of the best ever to enter the dohyo? Well, in sumo, as in basically every sport, there are a few different ways by which one could measure the quality of a career, and by basically all of them, Taiho was one of the best ever to do it. For a start, of course, there's the pure win-loss category, or I should say win-loss-draw. You can't draw in modern sumo anymore, as all matches must end in a result one way or the other, but that wasn't actually a rule until 1974, after Taiho retired from sumo. Up until that point, there were a few, admittedly very rare circumstances where it was possible to tie a match. For example, the Gyoji, the presiding judge of the match, could declare a tie if a match went on so long that both wrestlers were too exhausted to continue. Another potential tie scenario would be a match where a result was so close that it would normally result in a torinaoshi, a rematch, but one of the wrestlers was injured and unable to continue. Today, that would actually just be a loss for the injured wrestler. Anyway, by the numbers, here's how Taiho measures up. Over the course of his career, Taiho would wrestle in 87 honbasho, or major tournaments, of which there were 5 during his first year as a pro in 1957, and 6 every year after that. In total, over his career, he took part in 1,190 bouts, and over the span of the whole thing, he won 872 of those matches, lost 182, and was kyujo, a term meaning too injured to compete, for 136. Factoring in the kyujo, which traditionally are counted as a loss, that's about a 73% win rate over the course of his career. When you just look at Taiho's career in the top division, makuuchi, the highest ranking level of sumo competition, the best on best of the sport, the level that really gets the most media attention and interest, somehow the numbers get even more absurd because 1,026 of his bouts were at that level. In other words, the vast majority of his career. That is also where he picked up 746 of his 872 career wins, meaning overall his winning percentage in the top division is about the same as it is for his whole career, just slightly under 73%. That is insane. It's kind of hard to even wrap your head around if you watch sumo at all regularly. The number of promising wrestlers who shoot up the ranks into the top division only to hit an absolute brick wall, and if they are lucky, just barely be breaking even enough to stay in the top division, is very high. So the idea that any rikishi, any sumo wrestler, can win 3/4 of his matches across his entire career consistently, even in the top division, that's nuts. The next way to measure greatness is, of course, to use the system purpose-built by the Japan Sumo Association to do just that, the bansuke, the structure used to grade wrestlers. As a quick reminder, since we talked about this last week, the bansuke is broken down into divisions, with the major groupings of those divisions being first the low-level unpaid 7 matches a tournament ones, Jonokuchi, Jonidan, Sandanme, and Makushita, and then there's what's called the Sekitori ranks, the first paid tier, Juryo, and Makuuchi, the top division. Within each of these divisions, wrestlers are first assigned a direction, east or west, with east technically being more prestigious, and then a number, with a lower number being a better one. You move around on the bansuke based on your results in your most recent tournament. Win more than you lose and you go up, lose more than you win and you go down. There are rare exceptions to the movement formula, usually to do with instances where there's not space on the bansuke to be promoted or demoted into, but again, rare. And Taiho rocketed up the bansuke. He debuted in Jonokuchi, the lowest actually ranked division, in the New Year's tournament of 1957, and went 7-1, because back in his day, wrestlers at that level actually did 8 matches instead of 7, but that was later changed to an odd number of matches, so you'd either have a winning or losing record at the end of the tournament. Anyway, that showing was enough to get him to Jonidan, where he spent 2 tournaments, 6-2 and 7-1, before ending up in Sandanme for 4 tournaments. And in those 4 tournaments, where he fought 32 matches, he only lost 5 times, and along the way, picked up both his first Zensho, where you win every single match you fight in a tournament, and his first Yusho, which means being the winning wrestler overall in your division. That put him in Makushita by the time of the May 1958 tournament, and Makushita is the usual first big break point on the Bansuke. There are a lot of wrestlers in Makushita, and most of them are fighting for a very limited number of openings in the next division up, the one that comes with, among other things, pay and a lot more privileges. I cannot emphasize enough that if you watch sumo, and especially if you are a sick bastard like me who enjoys watching lower level divisions and not just the higher ones, you will see so many promising fighters get stuck in Makushita, winning enough to stay at the top end of the Makushita rankings, but just barely unable to earn one of the coveted promotions into the next rank. It took Taiho exactly 1 year, and his first genuinely bad tournament at 3-5, probably because he was injured, but sumo as a sport is notorious for not really disclosing injury status among Rikishi, for him to get out of Makushita. But a series of 3 6-2 tournaments, including a final one where he was Makushita 1 East, so literally the top of the level, was enough to do it. By May 1959, Taiho was in Juryo, which comes with some pretty nice perks if you make it that far. First, of course, you get paid, and that's always nice. Second, you get perks at your stable, the place where you train. In Taiho's case, up until May of 1959, he would not only have been wrestling and training under the auspices of Nishino Sekibeya, his home stable, but working essentially as a manservant for the stable's higher-ranking wrestlers. You don't get out of that until you hit Juryo and Makuuchi, because at that point you're doing 15 bouts a tournament instead of just 7 or 8. And at any rate, you're too important to the prestige of the stable to be wasting your time cleaning toilets or changing bed linens or making chanko nabe soup for your stablemates or whatever. It was also with his Juryo promotion that Taiho finally got his name. Up till this point, he'd actually been wrestling under his real name, Naya Koki, using his mother's last name. But making it to Juryo also earned him an actual shikona, a ring name. His oyakata, the master of Nishino Sekibeya, the former Ozeki Saganohana, was infamously very ornery, kind of unpleasant. He didn't like handing out ring names until he felt someone really earned it. Saganohana was apparently also a huge nerd for the Chinese classics and had a habit of picking shikona, ring names, full of elaborate allusions to Chinese literature. Taiho's is no different. Taiho is the Japanese pronunciation of the Chinese dapeng, or, well, okay, it's complicated, but it's a mythical bird that transforms out of a magic fish. The myth originates from one of my favorite works of classical Chinese philosophy, the Zhuangzi, written by the Taoist master of the same name, and it's a whole myth about the nature of perspective and greatness. We don't need to get sidetracked here. Read the Zhuangzi if you haven't, it's really interesting. But basically, it would be the equivalent, I guess, of like a nerdy football coach giving his player a nickname based on classical Latin or something like that, just to give you the idea. So armed with his very erudite new shikona, Taiho would enter his first Juryo tournament in May 1959. Now, Juryo by its very nature as the second highest division in Grand Sumo is generally full of 2 groups of wrestlers. The first are the up-and-comers, like Taiho in 1959, who've proven themselves thus far by making it through the first 4 divisions and into the big leagues. Now they're doing 15 matches a tournament for the first time, getting paid, not just receiving room and board for their stables, and they're really looking to get that breakthrough into the top division, to make the next leap up. The other group of Rikishi you tend to find in Juryo are those at the tail end of their careers, who make it to the top division but go on a losing streak, maybe too many makekoshi, losing records in the tournament, maybe a lingering injury, and thus they've fallen down into Juryo. They've been bumped out of the top division. They're frantically trying to claw their way back up into the top division, or at least prevent a further fall into Makushita, which remember would cost them their pay and set them back to doing all those low-level chores. There's also a small contingent of Juryo lifers, but there's only 28 spots in Juryo, so there's not a lot of room either way. The thing is, though, making it into Juryo is very hard, but making it into the top division is even harder. Again, there's only 28 spots in Juryo today. In Taiho's day, there were actually 40. But even with that expanded room back in the 50s, there wasn't a lot of space to move up and down. And every single Rikishi in Juryo was at one point a phenom, the best youth recruited for sumo in their hometown. I mean, if you've made it to Juryo, you're probably comfortably within the top 100 active sumo wrestlers in the world. The competition, even in the second division, is really tight. And the reason I am explaining all of this is because it is crazy how Taiho breezed through Juryo in 4 total tournaments. Again, it was also a bigger division back in his day than it is today. He only fought 60 matches to get promoted out of Juryo and only lost 16, most of those in his first 2 Juryo tournaments, where he still managed an overall 9-6 record in both. He also picked up a Yusho in his 3rd Juryo tournament, so he won the division overall, having the best record for the September 1959 tournament, and a Jun Yusho, a runner-up in November. So Taiho would start the January 1960 tournament about 2 years from his debut in sumo and just a few months shy of turning 20 in sumo's top division, Makuuchi, with the rank of Maegashira 13 West. Again, that's a crazy ascent through the ranks. He's not even 20 yet. Now, let's put a brief pin in things and talk about how the top division works, because this is going to be important both for Taiho's story and for the other ones we'll tell after it. So, most of the wrestlers in the top division, Makuuchi, hold one of the Maegashira ranks, starting from Maegashira 17 West up to Maegashira 1 East, so 34 in total. Above them are what are called the Sanyaku ranks, Komusubi, Sekiwake, and finally Ozeki, which are, with one exception, the pinnacles of sumo, titles only the best in the world can aspire to. Making it all the way up the Maegashira ranks through the Sanyaku up to Ozeki is incredibly punishing. First, of course, you have to get promoted all the way to Sekiwake, which means you need to be able to consistently win tournaments, and then beyond that, there's no hard and fast rule for making it to Ozeki, but generally it's not just about kachikoshi, about having more wins than losses in your last tournament at that point. The soft rule for promotion to Ozeki is, first, of course, you have to make it to Sekiwake, so that's pretty hard in and of itself, and then you need to net 33 wins over 3 tournaments, so 33 out of 45 matches, again a 73% win rate, to get promoted to Ozeki. Of course, Ozeki isn't even the absolute final stop, because the top Makuuchi division is also home to a special rank that stands above them all, the most famous rank in sumo, steeped in tradition and lore. I am, of course, referring to the Grand Champion, the Yokozuna. Now, Yokozuna, a word that literally means sideways rope, we'll get into what that means in a second, is a rank steeped in tradition and lore. The rank of Yokozuna, like most sumo ranks, has its origins back in the Edo period, in the dawn of organized sporting sumo. But back before the Japan Sumo Association, there wasn't a lot of consistency in how ranks were awarded, or even if they were, and who respected which promotions. The Japan Sumo Association has an official list of Yokozuna that go all the way back to the 1640s, and the legendary first Yokozuna, Akashi, but much like the list of emperors kept by the Japanese government that goes back to Jimmu, the accuracy of this particular legend is, let's call it, disputed. The current list of Yokozuna was compiled actually by the 12th Yokozuna on that list, Jinmaku, who lived during the Meiji era when sumo was transitioning from its more traditional origins to a modern sport. Jinmaku took it upon himself to be the chronicler of sumo's history up until that point as it became something more modern, and especially wanted to preserve the hallowed traditions of the Yokozuna. It wasn't until the promotion of the 32nd Yokozuna, Tamanishiki, that the Japan Sumo Association set up the modern criteria for attaining the rank. And if you're curious, in the year 2025, as I am recording this episode, the only current active Yokozuna is number 75, Hoshoryu, who is amazing, even though yes, he just had a terrible tournament. No, I will not be taking questions about my Hoshoryu fandom. I believe in him, he's gonna be great. So, I say the Japan Sumo Association has criteria for making someone a Yokozuna. That's not actually strictly true. There's an independent advisory board creatively called the Yokozuna Deliberation Council that recommends people for the rank. The Japan Sumo Association does every other level of promotion, but only the Yokozuna Deliberation Council is allowed to promote people to Yokozuna. The general expectation is that first you have to make it to the top of the regular Bansuke, the rank of Ozeki, and then you have to hold on to the Ozeki rank and manage either 2 Yusho, where you win the entire tournament with the best record, or 1 Yusho and 1 Jun Yusho. In other words, 1 tournament victory, 1 second place finish. But that's not a hard and fast rule. It's not just math. The Yokozuna Deliberation Council is also supposed to consider things like character and discipline and stuff like that. The Yokozuna Deliberation Council is a quasi-independent body backed by the Japanese government. It actually is technically still affiliated with the Ministry of Education. And again, it operates independently of the Japan Sumo Association, the idea being that it's therefore less susceptible to pressure to, say, promote someone because they're popular, or compromise on its basic rules about who deserves the rank. We'll talk more about the council at a later date, but right now I just want to establish what it is. So, if you get recommended for Yokozuna status by the Yokozuna Deliberation Council, a few things change about your career. First, of course, you get a tsuna, the rope from which the rank of Yokozuna gets its name. This is a white rope with paper streamers hanging from it that has its origins in Shinto iconography. You see tsuna of similar designs wrapped around sacred objects, especially trees, in many shrines today. In other words, it's a callback to sumo's relationship with traditional Japanese religion. Along with your tsuna, you get a special dohyo-iri, a ring entrance ceremony. Every wrestler in Juryo and Makuuchi does a dohyo-iri, but the Yokozuna has his solo, and it's a bit more complex than the standard one. It's hard to describe, but I'll try and find you some videos about regular dohyo-iri and Yokozuna ones to put in the show notes. Third, of course, to go with your new status, you get the hardest matches in the Bansuke. You wrestle everyone in the Sanyaku, the 3 champion ranks, the other Yokozuna, if there is one, because there can be more than one, and the highest ranking, best performing rank and filers from the Maegashira ranks. Fourth and finally, Yokozuna is the only rank you can't lose. There is no being demoted out of Yokozuna if you lose too much. That protection, though, does come with a price. Yokozuna who are on a losing streak are expected to put themselves on kyujo, injury leave, to avoid sullying their rank with too many losses. If you do that too often, you are going to start getting pressured to retire, because you can't give up Yokozuna status. The only way it stops is if you leave sumo as a sport. And if you perform too badly, you will be pressured into leaving sumo to avoid, again, disgracing the rank. The reason for these expectations has a lot to do with sumo's history, because the rule that Yokozuna don't get demoted is an ancient one, but it's also been a controversial one. Specifically, in 1950, there was a big scandal where not 1, not 2, but 3 active Yokozuna, Azumafuji, Terukuni, and Hagoroyama, decided to sit out a tournament for pretty flimsy reasons, leading to a lot of discussion about whether the Yokozuna were allowed too much privilege in deciding when to sit for flimsy health reasons to avoid challenging competition. Because it really can't be said enough, the schedule Rikishi go through at the high levels of sumo is grueling in terms of the expectations. Compound injuries and physical wear and tear are a constant problem, and Yokozuna being able to sit without fear of demotion, which you are still subject to at the regular ranks if you are absent because of an injury, was felt to give them a pretty wildly unfair advantage. The Yokozuna Deliberation Council exists because of this scandal. It was set up in the aftermath to make sure only those deserving got the rank, and to be an impartial voice telling Yokozuna who were taking advantage of their perks to stop it or to retire. So, this is what the top division landscape looks like. For all the distance Taiho had already climbed by 1960, he had further yet to go, and that makes what comes next even crazier. It took Taiho 3 tournaments to climb all the rank and file spots to the top of Makuuchi. By July 1960, he'd gone from Maegashira 13 to Komusubi, the first of the Sanyaku champion ranks. He'd also picked up 2 Kantosho, what are called Fighting Spirit Awards, one of 3 bonus prizes handed out to well-performing wrestlers in the top division that also come with a cash bonus. He also picked up what's called a Kinboshi, or Gold Star, awarded to anyone who's just in the rank-and-file Maegashira who beats a Yokozuna. In his case, he took down Asashio III, the 46th Yokozuna. And that's of course pretty prestigious, but a Kinboshi also gives you a permanent increase for your salary going forward, so it's a nice pickup for a few reasons. After making Komusubi, one 11-win 4-loss tournament was enough to get Taiho to Sekiwake, and he was so good there he got promoted in 2 tournaments. In September 1960, Taiho went 12-3, picking up a Junyusho, a 2nd-place finish, and losing out only to the Yokozuna himself, Wakanohana, and only then by a single match. He did get a nice consolation prize, the Ginosho, or Technique Prize, another of the 3 top division prizes. And then in November 1960, Taiho came firing back on all cylinders, going 13-2 and picking up the Yusho, the tournament win. Wakanohana sat out for half the tournament with an injury, so they didn't get a rematch. This was also Taiho's first top division Yusho. Spoilers, it's not the last. So it took Taiho 1 year, by January 1960, to make Ozeki, or champion. And he only got better here. He went on a tear in 1961. His worst performing result that year was in the first tournament as an Ozeki, where he only went 10 wins, 5 losses. So still a winning record, just not crazy dominant. He then picked up 2 consecutive 2nd-place finishes, or Junyusho, 12-3 in March, 11-4 in May, followed by a pair of Yusho tournament wins in July and September, at 13 wins, 2 losses, and 12 wins, 3 losses. By basically any modern standard, he probably would have made Yokozuna that summer. 2 Junyusho and a Yusho as an Ozeki is generally well above the standard today. So far as I can see, there were 2 reasons it took him until the last tournament in 1961 to get his final promotion in his career. First, he was still pretty young. He was just over 21, and hadn't even been in the top division for 2 years, so the Yokozuna Council was a little bit gun-shy about that. Second, he actually wasn't the only one in the race for the position of Yokozuna. All along the way, he'd been trading wins and losses with one of his biggest career rivals, Kashiwado Tsuyoshi. Kashiwado was 2 years Taiho's senior, born in 1938. Unlike Taiho, he was totally ethnically Japanese and born in the Japanese mainland, Yamagata Prefecture on the Japan Sea coast. He'd apparently been a sports fanatic from the time he was a child, but his parents, who were Gono, wealthy farmers who tended to dominate rural life in Japan, opposed their son going into such a pedestrian occupation. But Kashiwado was not deterred by his parents' opposition and ended up running away from home to join Isega Hamabeya, one of the other very prestigious stables of sumo, and a name you probably know if you follow the sport at all. Now, sports, in my humble opinion, has a lot of the draw it does because it is an engine for the generation of stories. And Kashiwado is very much the archetype of a certain type of classic sports story. What could have been? Which is kind of odd for me to say because, just to give you a sense of things, Kashiwado and Taiho spent most of 1961 battling for who would get promoted to Yokozuna, and the eventual solution of the Yokozuna Deliberation Council was to just throw their hands up in the air and promote both men to Yokozuna in time for the November 1961 tournament. Kashiwado, in other words, made it to the pinnacle of sumo. It's not like he had a bad career. Frankly, given how hard it is to do, just reaching and staying in the top division for any length of time is an incredible feat, to say nothing of making it to the top of the top division or making Yokozuna. And yet, Kashiwado is one of those rikishi, at least in my view, whose career exists so totally in the shadow of the legendary Taiho, it's hard not to wonder, how would things have looked if Kashiwado, every time he'd tried to win a tournament, hadn't had to face a giant Taiho-shaped roadblock? Because Kashiwado would remain active until 1969, and during that time he'd get 5 Yusho, 5 tournament wins. That's, I was going to say respectable, but that's very uncharitable of me. It's great. A single top division victory is an incredible achievement. Making it to Yokozuna with a Yusho under your belt, and then getting more of them, 5 more, as a Yokozuna, 6 top division Yusho in general, is amazing. It's a great performance at the pinnacle of the sport. It's just that in the same period of time, Kashiwado got 15 Jun Yusho, second place finishes in the top division tournament, and you can probably guess who he lost to for most of those. Because once Taiho became a Yokozuna, oh man, it unlocked something in him. Taiho would not retire until 1971, and during that time, he picked up 29 Yusho as a Yokozuna, plus 3 more Yusho in the top division before his promotion, so 32 total top division tournament wins. 8 of those were what are called Zensho, complete victories. You win every single match in all 15 days. Twice, he won 6 tournaments in a row, every single tournament for an entire calendar year. Taiho shockingly actually doesn't have the record for most Yusho of all time. He did back in his day, but not anymore. If people really enjoy the history of sumo, and I get the feedback that you want more of this, at some point we will cover the absolutely insane career of Hakuho and his absurd 45 Yusho. But anyway, at its time, the Taiho-Kashiwado rivalry made for some peak sumo, but it was very one-sided as a rivalry. Yeah, Kashiwado did pull one out every so often, but you have to wonder how many more of those Jun Yusho would have just been regular Yusho, actual first-place finishes, had he not been up against basically the GOAT of his time, the best there was in the sport. It wasn't even like Taiho beat down Kashiwado in like a dominant way. Their final record head-to-head was 21-16 favoring Taiho, which is a clear edge, but it's not domination. It's just that, first of all, Taiho was so dominant against everyone else too, and second, Kashiwado had a constant injury problem throughout his career, to the point of jokingly getting the nickname the Glass Yokozuna because of the number of tournaments he had to pull out of. Anyway, from the time Taiho was 21, the youngest Yokozuna ever at the time, though a few decades later that record too would be broken, to the time he retired in 1972 at the age of 32, Taiho was sumo. He was the best rikishi in the world, and it was not close. He was one of the most famous people in Japan, because at the pinnacle of his career, the 1960s, well, that was also the age of one of the bigger social shifts in post-war Japanese history, the mass adoption of television. To be fair, it took until the 70s for TV to become truly ubiquitous in Japan, but in the 60s, the TV market was growing rapidly, and sports, including sumo, were both a big driver of growth for the TV market and a big thing to watch once you actually, bought a TV. As a result, there's actually a good number of Taiho matches up on YouTube today, and watching them you really get a sense of how good he was. He's not huge by any measure. He wasn't obviously bigger or stronger than his opponents. But his balance and strength were incredible. I'm going to put a couple of highlight matches up in the show notes again, so I'm not going to try and describe them here, but you should go watch them if you're interested. Taiho's popularity was such that his wedding in November 1966, scheduled for the final day of that month's tournament, which, by the way, Taiho also won, and that was one of the ones he did with a Zensho, a 15-match winning streak, drew 1,000 guests and more than 200 reporters. It was one of the biggest news stories of the day. I couldn't get hard and fast numbers for this, but I'm pretty sure that that's more guests than then Crown Prince Akihito got at his wedding in 1959. Of course, Taiho had scandals as well, most rikishi do. The biggest one came in 1965 when he got caught actually alongside Kashiwado, smuggling a gun back from the United States after a stint in Hawaii. The two were apparently pretty friendly outside the ring and had gone shooting together and brought back a handgun. But the JSA is also very good at covering up scandals, something else we'll probably talk about in a future episode. And so, as far as I know, beyond paying a fine, Taiho never really got in much trouble for this. He really was kind of the golden boy of the sport. Taiho is also, by the way, the main reason sumo was one of the first sports in the world to adopt a distinctly modern technique in its very traditional judging: instant replay. The incident, you see, came about as a result of the March 1969 tournament, which Taiho entered on something of a hot streak. Going into it, Taiho had not lost a match for half a year, not since the first day of last year's September tournament, meaning he had 44 consecutive match wins, and by the way, gotten a pair of Zensho perfect records in November and January. And in its own right, that's crazy, but it also meant Taiho had a good shot now at breaking one of sumo's biggest and longest standing records, held by one of the legends of the sport. That record belongs to Futabayama Sadaiji, the 35th yokozuna, whose career spanned the mid-1930s to 1945, because yes, there were still tournaments during World War II, though a few did get cancelled. Futabayama, you see, got his yokozuna promotion by going on a crazy hot streak starting in March 1936, and proceeded to win a nice 69 consecutive matches, an insane statistic. Since it was established, that record had not come anywhere close to being broken, but in March 1969, Taiho looked like he had a shot at the record. 44 consecutive wins going into the tournament was, well, still a distance off, but he had a chance. And he won his first day match against the Komusubi Fujinokawa. But then came day 2. Taiho was up against the Maegashira 1 East, Toda, in a close-fought match, but the Gyoji, the referee, called it for Taiho. Except the Gyoji doesn't actually get the final say. There are also shimpan, referees, mostly elders of the Sumo Association, around the ring, who can overturn the verdict if they think the Gyoji is wrong. And that's what happened. The shimpan called a conference, called a monoi in sumo, and said the judgment was wrong. Taiho stepped out of the ring. Toda is the winner. This, of course, brought an end to Taiho's win streak, and that was particularly embarrassing because the next day photos of the match in the nation's newspapers clearly showed Toda had stepped out of the ring first. The initial ruling of the Gyoji had been correct. Taiho had actually won. In terms of Futabayama's 69 win record, it probably wouldn't have mattered. Taiho had a nagging injury that required him to go on leave, breaking the streak during the tournament. But the fact that Taiho's run had been cut off with such a simple mistake, the sort of thing that should have been very easy to catch, led to pressure on the Japan Sumo Association, and very shortly thereafter, a system of replay review was added to the rules. There are now 2 more shimpan, 2 more judges, who sit in a separate booth watching the match from multiple video angles, and one of the shimpan who's actually at the dohyo, at the ring, is wired up to be able to talk to him. And that is all thanks to Taiho. By comparison, the major North American sports leagues didn't really start adding replay review, to my understanding, until the 2000s. I'm sure all of this was cold comfort to Taiho, though, because it did cut short his shot at Futabayama's record, but also, I don't really think, even as good as Taiho was, that record could actually be broken. Futabayama was able to do what he did because in the 30s and 40s, there were many fewer annual tournaments, 2 or 3 instead of 6. As a result, Futabayama had a lot more recovery time. I don't know that I think anyone will ever beat his record given the nature of the modern sumo schedule, which has so little downtime for Rikishi that lingering injuries become way more of a problem. 2 men have gotten closer than Taiho did. Chiyono Fuji, one of the great yokozuna of the 80s, and Hakuho, probably statistically the best ever, but to this day, as of 2025, Futabayama's record still has not been broken. And there was one other area where Taiho's hopes never came to fruition. As he became the face of sumo in the 60s, the Japan Sumo Association started sending him on international tours to promote the sport. And one of the places they sent him on tour in 1966, shortly after his wedding, was the Soviet Union. Now, given his Ukrainian heritage, this was a bit of a loaded trip for Taiho, especially because, remember, he had no idea what happened to his father, Markian Borishko, after Taiho and his mother had fled the advance of the Soviet Union in 1945. Now, the Soviet Union in 1966 was, well, not an entirely different place from what it had been in 1945. It was still, a single-party dictatorship. But Stalinism was a historical relic. The Khrushchev era had seen the most extreme views in the Soviet Communist Party moderated quite a bit, and by 1966, the new government of Leonid Brezhnev was more invested in diplomacy and a positive overseas image for the Soviet Union. What I'm getting at is that when Taiho went to the Soviet Union and started asking around about his father during the course of his tour, there were plenty of officials who were willing to try and help him figure out what happened. But willing is not the same thing as able. Records from the immediate post-war were uneven, to say the least, and Taiho never figured out what happened to his father. It was only well after the fall of the Soviet Union that the family was able to dig up records on the truth with the help of a Japanese researcher working in Sakhalin, whose work more or less confirmed their worst fears. Markian Berishko had avoided arrest until 1949. There were still a lot of prisoners to work through after all, but in that year he was finally identified by the local Soviet government on Sakhalin and arrested for anti-Soviet activities. He served 5 years of a 10-year sentence in the Gulag system before being released as part of the wide-ranging amnesties that followed the death of Joseph Stalin. He worked as a guard in the local museum before catching pneumonia. He died in November 1960, right in the middle of Taiho's tournament run towards becoming an Olzeki, the first tournament, by the way, where he won the top division. I don't know how much sumo wrestling news made it into Sakhalin in the 50s and 60s. For his sake, I hope Markian Berishko was able to hear at least a little bit about his son's career. Taiho would finally retire in 1971, still very much at the peak of his popularity after winning the New Year's tournament and coming in second in March. But a host of injuries and a hard career after more than 10 years was finally starting to catch up to him, and after a series of losses to the up-and-coming Olzeki, Takanohana, he decided to call it quits and announced his retirement. In his day, Taiho was one of the best sumo had to offer, and even though some of his records have been surpassed since, if you still look at a list of various records in top division sumo, odds are Taiho's name will be somewhere in the top 10. We'll talk more about Taiho's legacy next week as we segue into the future of sumo, but for now, that's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the show on Patreon. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for part 3.